Welcome everyone to this featured panel. Great to have you here on the last day of the lunch, fantastic. I would like to welcome you, and you see all, I'm not, maybe I need to make it a bit, yeah. You see that I'm not Jackie, our president. She organized this panel. She asked me to step in, and I'm very happy that I could step in to learn so many new things. Actually, I'm network organizer, but I was a founding member of the SASE greening working group, which some of you might know. And well, in the sense of micropolitics being engaged in this topic, Jackie asked me to step in, and I'm happy to do so. My name is Cornelia, and I'm a network organizer of Network F on innovation, which even has some fit, maybe, or not. Let's see. So I have fantastic speakers here. You can really be excited as I am. The first speaker is Alice Ma. Alice is a professor of sociology. I think most of you will know her. She's working at the University of Warwick, and her topic is environmental justice. And what is absolutely great, she just won an ERC startup grant on environmental justice, and her talk will be related to this. She's also author of a book. I had looked at it. The title is Plastic Unlimited. I thought of our plastic water bottles here, by the way. Plastic Unlimited, how corporates are fooling the environmental crisis. So a great book, and I recommend you to have a look at it, maybe even to buy it. We didn't talk about it, but it's a great book. Second, I'm very happy to welcome Joana here. Joana, you're great with your, it's great to have you with the topic on climate litigation, which is also the focus on this panel. Climate litigation is one tool to overcome the climate crisis, and Joana is Assistant Professorial Research Fellow at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change at the LSE. And some of you may know that this institute has the world's largest resource on climate change laws and litigations, and it's fantastic. I think since 2020 you lead this resource, so it's a fantastic resource and having access to it. This panel is about tools to climate mobilization. It will also focus on litigation, not only, but also as one tool. And I think therefore it nicely links to the conference theme on activism. This is also why Jackie thought this featured panel is really very important for the conference. It reminds me of a historical decision of the German federal constitutional law in last year, maybe you referred to it, where Fridays for Future filed in, and it was in German newspaper, a historical success that climate goals are not tough enough in Germany. Let's see what you will say about it and what we can learn from you. The floor is yours. You have each 20 minutes, and afterwards we have a discussion and questions from the audience.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, Cornelia, and yeah, thanks to the organizers and to Jackie O'Reilly for inviting us. So our panel is a little bit unusual in that we had not met before, neither Joanna and I, and we were asked to put together a presentation that spoke to the same theme. So we wrote an abstract together without having collaborated before. And so we tried to find a common ground between climate litigation and the plastics and petrochemical industry. And this is where we've wound up. And yeah, very much trying to speak to the theme of activism. So I'm going to do kind of part one, which is around what I'm calling multi-scalar environmental justice activism. And the second part will be more around climate litigation with Joanna. So the focus on activism. So I'm going to pose a kind of deceptively straightforward or simple question, difficult yet straightforward question, which is, over the past decade, we've seen an enormous amount of climate mobilization and resistance movements related to climate emergency, the pipeline protests, Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion. We all know, the kind of uptick in this as a major groundswell of movement to address this issue. Yet, at the same time, you would think with all this activism, with all this policy impetus to do something to really address this very urgent crisis that becomes ever more urgent with every report that comes from the IPCC, there has been increasing fossil fuel expansion and petrochemical build-out during this time. So why is that? Does activism make no difference at all? Does all these really smart people around the world putting all the resources into thinking about it make it any difference? So what does this actually mean for the possibilities of climate activism as a lever for change? That's the question I'm going to grapple with. So I think this conference has been really fantastic, and political economy in general is really fantastic at identifying the obstacles. Capitalism, racial capitalism, fossil fuel capitalism, vested interests, political economic structures, all founded on fossil fuels. So just a few of the obstacles that we've talked about, and I've been attending this wonderful network mini conference on the political economy of climate change. So the sheer magnitude of this unfolding climate catastrophe, what can we do about it? These really powerful actors that show no signs of changing. And if they do, they're doing it in sort of slightly business as usual or surreptitious ways of kind of co-opting agendas. The systemic problems of climate injustice around the world, where the most vulnerable people are the most affected. The failure to deal with the colonial legacies around climate reparations. The failure, some might have a different perspective, but overall, the failure over decades for international climate policy to move in a meaningful direction towards addressing this emergency, the dominance of market-led, incremental, technocratic solutions by business and policy elites, and within activism and within ordinary citizens, a really profound sense of eco-anxiety for even thinking about and holding in your mind the urgency of this issue, and a deep pessimism even among activists that I think isn't perhaps as present on other kinds of activism. So I attended the COP26 in Glasgow. I lived in the UK, and our university sent a delegation. And coming through the pandemic, tens of thousands of people who were there, overwhelmed with all this bombardment of doomsday scenarios, I was very profoundly shaken attending this conference, and as many, I think, who were there and who attend these spaces are, at just being confronted with this knowledge and this displaying and this performance and this energy around the urgency of the climate emergency. But this sort of powerlessness and almost kind of blasé attitude actually among some, that there's nothing that is going to actually happen in this space. A lot of activists and colleagues said, we've been here before, we've been doing this for years, what did you expect? Was it really going to be any different? The blah, blah, blah of Greta Thunberg, which was a catchphrase, was actually from 1995 in Berlin, as Andreas Malm points out in his book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline. And this idea of a death sentence was repeated at numerous COPs. So what has changed, what will change? And we all know that there was a sense of disappointment and failure at this. And I think this showcasing of climate injustice throughout, it's loads of media headlines. It was seen, yet it wasn't seen. And I was, one of the most moving speeches there was from Vanessa Nakete, the Ugandan climate youth activist, who basically said, we don't believe you to the leaders. I'm here to prove us wrong. And they didn't prove her wrong. So there were many among these activists who contemplated seriously the implications of failure. So this was a quote from one of the activists write in a press conference as it was coming to a conclusion, don't give us hope. The message that we must take is that this is a moment of intensification of resistance to the fossil fuel industry. This is a license to us, this is an invitation to us that every fossil fuel infrastructure everywhere in the world needs civil disobedience. We will make no apologies, it can no longer be activism as usual. So this echoes what Andreas Malm has widely been reported to talk about in relation to being disenchanted effectively with peaceful climate activism. But by focusing only on fossil fuel infrastructure and avoiding those questions about the difficulties and the dilemmas and the livelihoods surrounding just transitions, who benefits and who loses in these difficult processes, that wasn't really taken up there. And you haven't seen very much coming out even though there are these calls, you don't see all over the place, direct action, this huge taking into account of urgency. So that's sort of like a personal foray into the climate activist thinking. So what I'm going to briefly reflect on here is actually just a few insights from field research that I've done as part of a very large project, as Cornelia mentioned, that was funded by the European Research Council over 5 years, which extended through the pandemic. It's actually just completed, which is a multi-sided project about the global petrochemical industry in relation to corporate power and environmental justice, focusing on the US, China, and Europe. Looking not only at environmental justice groups, but also at corporate power. And so my latest book is focusing on the corporations, Plastic Unlimited, but it ends with, so what can we do about it? And the next book is much more focused on those battles, the multi-scalar battles between fence line, environmental justice communities, other activists, and major petrochemical corporations. So the petrochemical industry is very important for the climate crisis because it is actually kind of a relatively hidden player operating between the oil and gas, chemical and plastics industries. It's at the intersection of a number of overlapping crises. So not only climate crisis as a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, but also toxic pollution, which is where my starting point was, plastic waste, biodiversity loss, and ecological overshoot due to overconsumption. And as the late environmental health activists Theo Colburn said, we've got to make the fossil fuel connection between oil and gas and toxic petrochemicals used in plastics, particularly in the case of fracking in the US. And then on the other side, from the industry perspective, there is this sort of sense that there is a threat from the environmental movement of this like one-way street, they said, towards stricter environmental regulation. So there's that kind of basically a kind of, as I argue throughout the book, a multi-scalar, multi-frontal battle emerging across different sectors, and that the industry has, a very tough and very warlike mentality in terms of quashing opposition. So what do I mean by multi-scalar? I mean, basically, what I became quite interested in through the research was how people living next to petrochemical plants who've lived there for decades and have been fighting against discrimination and pollution and environmental racism all this time have started through the intensification of these environmental crises, of the radar of plastic waste, of the climate emergency, have started to bring together their cause, which is often ignored, and in terms of the toxic exposures that they face, and how that's actually been quite, in some cases, some limited cases, beneficial to their struggles. And I would argue that it is important not to forget that there are opportunities. I wouldn't say necessarily for the language of coalitions as such, but yeah, coalitions, but also thinking across different issues, thinking across different interests, and thinking about these different scales of action and how these are not separate issues, and they're often treated as such. I think importantly as well, it's not just about scaling up. because scaling up is about kind of almost flattening or being global, being similar. It's also about burrowing below and thinking of alternative different strategies at different scales. And I really like this idea by Max Lieberman and Josh Lepowski in Discard Studies, a new book that's just come out, where they talk about scale as relationships that matter within a situated context to account for different scales of struggle and analysis. So I'm just going to whiz through a few examples of what I mean by multiscalar activism. You can cut me off if I run out of time to give you some examples. I mean, I think one of the most interesting and inspiring examples is coming from the Break Free from Plastic movement, which grew out of anti-incinerator struggles in Southeast Asia in 2016, founded by Juan Hernandez, winner of the Goldman Environmental Prize for his really exemplary campaigning against waste incineration, and really starting to connect those issues around plastic pollution, waste incineration, and toxic colonialism in the Southeast Asia and Africa with what's happening at the other end of the plastics life cycle, at the production end, with the toxic exposures in close proximity to Black and ethnic minority and working class communities. So linking how plastics is not a separate issue, but it is actually fundamentally a climate issue. I won't go into the arguments on that, but that is one point of interconnection. Another is around the combining of indigenous struggles against pipelines in the protection for their land rights, and how that has intersected with climate activism. I mean, I think especially many of you would be very well aware of the example of Standing Rock, where in 2016 it brought global media attention, global political attention, a lot of activists coming together in the United States. Tyler McCreary and Jerome Turner talk about how inspiring it is that many of the indigenous mobilizations have an idea of territorial defense, which actually has a sense of multi-scalar responsibility that extends beyond their own territory to consider how interconnections at multiple scales, global, local, national, are all part of a conjoined ecosystem, and therefore they extend the struggle beyond the particularity of the local. One example in our research where we saw this was actually at what is known as the tail end of the Black Snake, or of the tail end of the Dakota Access Pipeline, which is the Bayou Bridge pipeline that came just a few months after, in 2016, to the area known as Cancer Alley in the United States, which has a very high concentration of petrochemical facilities and a very long history of environmental justice activism over toxic exposures in African American communities. And there was a very inspiring convergence between, but a small one, like dozens of people as opposed to thousands of people at Standing Rock in opposition of this against this pipeline. Ultimately, like Standing Rock, it did fail, and the pipeline came anyway. But I think this quote from Shari Voigtlin, who is one of the indigenous water protectors there, reflected on what it meant for her to have failed. And she says, we have to tell people that it's not just all right to fail, but it is a necessary part of contributing to protecting our planet. Future generations don't need ancestors who only found value in obvious, immediately measurable wins. They need to be willing to fall on our faces over and over until we and they all can win. To me, that would be the greatest success, maybe the only success that matters. Just going to quickly give you a kind of contrasting case in China. So China is a really different kind of context where the petrochemical industry is dominated by state-owned enterprises, where there have been very widespread and well-known anti-PX or paraxylene protests since 2007, although they've more or less dried up in the last few years under Xi Jinping due to more repression of protests. And petrochemical plants in China are heavily concentrated in industrial clusters, which means that they have a lot of very intense levels of hazard. So a lot of the issues there are around health and safety, like just quite a few major, deadly, large explosions that kill people. And there's been quite a lot of government repression around that kind of news reporting coming out of those places. So the area that we looked in wasn't a place where there have been these anti-PX protests. It was in Nanjing, a place that's surrounded on all sides by chemical industry. Because it's been an area like that for a long time, there wasn't a lot of protests. I won't get into it in a great amount of detail. There has been some effort by the government to try to the local government to try to change the dangerous situation of trapped air, but as yet with not a lot of success. And so the kind of activism that we saw there was so sort of small and subtle. There was this quote, the culture here in Nanjing has its characteristic. People here are dubbed large turnips. Why? It's from the saying, every turnip to its hole, which means every person to their own position in a way. So it's a very pragmatic approach to dealing with environmental problems. They focus on, in their case, on measuring toxic pollutants, bigger issues like climate or sectional kinds of themes aren't as prevalent. So they're really practical, working together with government and just trying to change almost one person's view at a time and to address those problems. But they do connect to a wider struggle in terms of, addressing the issue and finding a practical step forward. And yeah, that image there is the coal plant in behind the petrochemical transport industry. So what I'm going to leave you with is this lovely quote from Our History is the Future by Nick Estes, about reflecting on an indigenous historian reflecting on Standing Rock and the lessons learned, kind of echoing that lesson about failure, about a retake of Marx's revolutionary figure of the mole who breaks through the surface of history. And so he's saying, revolution is just one moment in the longer moment of history, or longer movement of history. If the mole is easily defeated on the surface by counter-revolutionary forces, if she hasn't adequately prepared her subterranean spaces, which provides shelter and safety, even when pushed back down underground, the mole doesn't stop her work. He then talks about how the mole is really significant in Lakota culture, and says, this subterranean work is just as important to building an alternative, world of possibility. So thank you.
Hello, good afternoon. I will switch to the next presentation. And I really like this quote with the mole. Actually, it made me think about how litigation has been doing that, a lot of the underground. So I'll try to link. So, well, good afternoon, everyone. As Alice said, we are going to do a two-part presentation on this topic of tools of climate mobilization and resistance, mine being climate change litigation. Before, I want to thank everyone, especially Professor Jackie O'Reilly, for inviting me. It is exciting to speak to, I don't know what you call yourselves, a group of socio-economics scholars. I'm more used to speaking to legal scholars and lawyers and consultants, which is a different crowd. So good to be here. And when I talk to the legal crowd, they're interested in something very specific about what cases are winning, what is making us lose, and specificities of law. So today I thought I would do something different. So a bit of an experiment, and it's also work that I'm doing in a working paper, which is start exploring the wider impacts of climate litigation as a mobilization tool. So yeah, that's the fun part about doing interdisciplinary work, which I try to do at the Grantham. So I don't know, have you ever heard about climate litigation? Good. Usually people are a bit put off by legal stuff, because the lawyers are not the most exciting bunch. But climate litigation is very exciting. And it has turned, in these years that I've been working on this topic, a very exciting topic. So these are news from last week, right? I just got whatever was from last week. Actually, the Guardian piece is covering a report that we published last week, which I invite you all to look. Some self-advertising here. And so we published this report with the global trends in climate litigation, which the Guardian covered. But the photo, the Santos climate criminals, is a photo referring to Australian giant oil and gas company, which is now involved in a climate washing or greenwashing case. So they're being sued for their greenwashing net zero targets. An interesting case. The second piece, the one that was published 2 days ago in the FT, talks about another really fascinating case, which I will get back towards the end. So this gentleman is Saul Luciano Liuya. And Saul is a farmer and a mountaineer guide in the Peruvian Andes. The title of the article says it, "Who pays for climate change? The Peruvian suing a German utility." So this Peruvian farmer who lives up there in the Andes is suing RWE, the German's largest energy utility company in the world. And he's suing RWE because he says that RWE doesn't operate in Peru, has nothing to do with Peru in principle. But that's the thing with climate change, right? This company has been emitting for hundreds of years. That has accumulated, that has exacerbated the melting of glaciers above his village of Huaraz. And now Huaraz is at risk of being inundated by melting glaciers. So what does he do? He sues RWE in Germany. And this is, maybe for you it makes sense because that's the story we're talking about. For lawyers, this is mind-blowing. It's like, what? Peruvian farmer suing RWE in Germany? Asking for compensation, financial compensation for climate change? So that's really mind-blowing, and this is the kind of case that we're talking about. So I will introduce you to some of these cases and then have that thinking about what is going on there. Before that, just in case you want a definition, of course, like any area of social sciences, there's a lot of discussion of how to define climate litigation, and a lot has been written about. We take a quite narrow approach, which I know it's limited. I'll tell you later why we do this narrow approach, but we consider climate litigation as the judicial and quasi-judicial cases where climate science or climate policy are a material issue in the proceedings. So if the case is relevant to climate, let's say anything, right, in this planet is relevant to climate, especially if you think air pollution, deforestation, planning, all of this is relevant. We don't cover that just because it's too much and we don't have the resources. So we consider climate litigation every lawsuit or administrative case that has explicitly a discussion on climate. And this involves many areas of law. Think, tax law, civil law, tort law, criminal law, constitutional law, human rights law, commercial law. It's super, super broad and vast. And this is all around the world. So I'll show you what is happening in terms of numbers. This is one of the things that I've been working a lot in the past years, which is we maintain a database of all the climate cases in the world. Look what's going on, right? It started, first cases, late 80s, very few cases, and then poof, it goes up significantly. majority, vast majority in the US, but growing elsewhere. So in terms of numbers, now we have over 2,000 cases, being over 1,500 in the US. And what is interesting is that it's expanding beyond the US, and that only, if you see, a quarter of the cases have been filed in the last 2 years. So it is very much happening now. Where this is happening, we've tracked climate litigation cases in 43 countries around the world, as I said, majority in the US and Australia and Canada, but growing in Europe and other global south countries. So now we know of 88 cases in the global south, many in Latin America, some in Africa, the African continent, and Southeast Asia. In addition to that, we have also international and regional courts and tribunals. Okay. It's a vast number of cases, over 2,000. Not every case is one of these that will reach the headlines. These are cases that we artificially, and I know there are problems in doing that, but artificially we call them strategic litigation. But this is the kind of case that I think is interesting for us also, because it's the case that is trying to, what? Mobilize people against those actors that are most responsible for the problem and most also able to address the problem. Guess who they are? Governments and corporations, particularly major emitters. If you try to narrow down the 2,000 cases to what is strategic, so it's not brought with an individual issue between the two parties, but it has that wider ambition to try to change corporate and government behavior, we see how this has grown. So litigation used to be brought to clarify some aspect of the law, you know, like a lot of litigation is, and then people start realizing, well, we can use this strategically. Think about LGBT, think about other human rights movements that have used litigation strategically. So this is what starts happening after 2015, particularly after 2019. And we've been seeing this growth and asking ourselves, you know, what is this leading to? Well, just this year, the IPCC, which you might have heard about, this group of scientists that condenses the state of the art of the knowledge around climate change, for the first time, the IPCC understood that climate litigation is something worth looking, and there's a whole section on Assessment Report 6 by Working Group 3 on climate litigation, trying exactly to understand what it is. Not only there's a whole section, but climate litigation made it all the way to the summary for policymakers, which is, you know, in IPCC, international governance, quite a big thing because you need all states to approve those messages. So what the message says, it says, climate litigation plays a role affecting the outcome and ambition of climate governance. Okay, so now we have this idea that litigation is affecting climate governance, is therefore a tool to address this problem. Let's understand what that means. Before that, just this exclamation mark here to remind myself and you that not only not all litigation is strategic, but not all litigation is good guys against bad guys trying to save the planet. Quite the opposite. The majority of cases actually have been filed by corporations, and corporations use litigation to weaken regulation, to sometimes what we call slap, so kind of threaten activists. So it comes both ways. So that's something to keep in mind too. But you know, we'll focus on the cool cases about saving the planet because they give us hope. So why do they give us hope? And here we've seen that there's this surge in climate litigation, that there are some, and I'll talk to you about some bold decisions. And what the question that I want to answer here in my 10 minutes left is, what are the prospects of courts becoming a transformative force in global climate governance? You know, are they potentially a force? What type of force? And I will end, it's a spoiler, I will end with an invitation for you guys, because I feel that the lawyers, they get very hooked into the details and they're not looking at this type of question. is this transformative? To what extent? On the one hand, on the other hand, type of question that I'm sure you'll be much better to answer. So let me go to the one hand and the other hand. On one hand, courts could potentially guide or transform climate governance. Well, courts have in most countries, and the judiciary has power. It is respected in most democracies. It can even control the other powers or guide policymaking. So that's something we would have hope for when we seek courts. On the other hand, it's true that this is, as you saw, very recent. So the case law is far from being settled. There's a lot of precedent that is very much against climate protections. And even if you look at the successful cases, it's not clear whether they have led to significant emission reductions or additional policy. There are cases, and I will talk about a few, that have achieved that, but it's still early. You know, the thing with litigation is, and this is why no one likes it, it's very expensive, it's very risky. And even if you get through the whole thing and end with a successful decision, not necessarily that will immediately transform and convert into immediate action, right? It's still a piece of paper that says you should do more or stop doing that. So that's the other hand. But I think in balance, we can agree that courts play a unique and probably a critically important role in maintaining the rule of law, seeking justice, and the law has this role of being a mediator. You know, like, I think A, I think B, what middle grounds can you find, or who's right, who's wrong? Sometimes it interprets something. So is climate change a matter of human rights? Lawyers spent years trying to do that, and only now are getting this recognition, but you know, it is something important. And sometimes courts innovate, and I'll give you some examples of where courts have been really innovating. So this has been a bit abstract. Let me give you some examples. So I'll make 2 points. The first one is that litigation is helping to reshuffle power relations. And I'll look at that in terms of communities, NGOs, and citizens, giving a few examples. The first one, this very cheerful "we won," this was the landmark case in the world of climate litigation. Everyone who studies this topic will know this case. It was a case very local here. It's a Dutch case, filed by an NGO called Urgenda against the Dutch government. So the case was filed in 2013. In 2015, they won the first time the District Court of The Hague gave them the first successful decision. What does this case do? This case is the first time that a court told a government, you are not doing enough. You have to step up, you have to increase your ambition, you have to reduce your emissions. Why this is a big deal? And it goes to powers. And this is how lawyers understand powers. For lawyers, power is about, you have 3 branches of power, executive, legislative, judiciary, and they should work in a balanced way, and one shouldn't tell the other one what to do. This is exactly why Urgenda was groundbreaking, because you had a court telling a government, you're doing badly, you have to do more. So that was like, whoa, a court can do that? And it did. So the government appealed. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. December 2019, the Supreme Court decided that the government was not doing enough. And that has led the Dutch government to phase out coal, to invest millions in energy efficiency. So, you know, kind of, this is the case I said, you can see actual reductions and behavior change. And then there are many other cases that represent these communities. So the second one, L'affaire du siècle, is a case that was filed in France against the French government. So this is an NGO, which is already interesting, like the other one. NGOs represent, in the non-US, 90% of cases this year were filed by NGOs. So they're pretty on it. Not only NGOs, in 2 weeks, this NGO put out a petition for people to support the case. This is how you don't need to be a lawyer, but you can be involved in the case. In 2 weeks, they got 2.3 million signatures. So these are French citizens who are signing and putting money for litigation. They think that, this thing is not working. I want my government to be sued. So 2 million people decided to, somehow sue their government. Then this third photo is the one that Cornelia mentioned, the Neubauer case. Neubauer, Luisa, the one in the middle top, she's the German Goethe. And she's been doing a lot of activism. She led the Fridays for Future in Germany. At some point, also, with COVID, you couldn't go much to the streets. Goethe also did the same. They decided to file cases. So Luisa, with other young people, filed a case against the German government. And they won. They won all the way in the Constitutional Court in Germany. You're not talking about any irrelevant country. You're talking about a major country where now a court was saying, your target's not good enough. So these are cases against states. Then you have this issue with power of cases against corporations, the big major corporations. I told you about Sao Luciano Liuya. So he's seeking compensation from RWE. The next case is a case in the Philippines, which is not a judicial case, but it was an investigation carried out by the Human Rights Commission of the Philippines, seeking to understand the responsibility of carbon majors for human rights threats. They concluded 2 months ago with a report that says that these corporations are responsible for the threats that are being caused to human lives, with them not changing the way they operate. And then you also have the powerless states. So this news from last month in The Guardian talks about Vanuatu, a small island at risk of being submerged. And Vanuatu is seeking an advisory opinion from the ICJ, the International Court of Justice. And this means, it's non-binding, but it means if they get an advisory opinion saying that causing climate change is a crime, that triggers litigation everywhere around the world. So you have, with all these examples, what you could think about a David and Goliath. So the powerless against the power. 3 minutes. I might need 4, but I might do with 3. So now I get to the downside of this story. It all sounded really cool and exciting, and everyone felt very energized. But there are also distributive issues that I think we have to consider. So I'm putting here 2, but there are more. So the first one, the David and Goliath. Sao Luciano against RWE, right? Think about that. And this other photo here, again, a major victory, again in the Netherlands. This is Milieu Défensif against Shell, and in June last year, they won. Basically the same idea that Urgenda won. The state has a duty of care towards citizens. They obtained that from the same court of The Hague, a decision that says that Shell has a duty of care to protect lives. So that's pretty important. They're very happy, they're celebrating. Anecdotally, recently I was in a panel with a lawyer from one of these top global legal firms, and we were chatting, off the records, and she was telling me that Shell, she's working for Shell, her law firm, and she said, Shell said, spend as much as you want. There's no limit. Hire all the top lawyers, all the experts that you want. Spend as many hours as you want. And these guys charge, I don't know, 3,000 euros per hour. And this is how they are taking this case seriously. They lost, and now they are going to put millions to pay lawyers to defend the case. So then you have Milieu Défensif lawyers, and this is Roger Cox, who is one of the masterminds behind, really invested and, spending their weekends working on the case. And then you have hundreds of White and Case and Freshfields and, all these Linklater lawyers thinking, how are we going to destroy this case, right? So the David and Goliath, yes, it brings them, the farmer, together with RWE, same level, but behind them, there is a lot of inequality in terms of resources. And then the second issue there, which is the just transition, something that we've been talking here about, how sometimes a climate policy will be beneficial for climate, but not great for communities. And there are now increasingly examples of communities that, from like the coal workers or indigenous communities that are relocating in Mexico for the construction of wind turbines. And how do you balance? That's the old story of how you balance different interests, human rights and climate protection. And how do you do that? A decision that is climate aligned might not be great for people who are already vulnerable. So I stop here with these examples, and I finish with an invitation. So as I said, the legal scholars, they stop quite short. They understand litigation as a classic separation of powers issue. I think this is quite anachronistic and limited. So my invitation for you is, can you please help us understanding litigation as an artificial or perhaps natural way of equalized power, where we can look at this from the intra as well as intergenerational empowerment, and look at the impacts on policy and political domains beyond the courts. And my last slide has the two links. The blue thing on the screen is our database, which you can look, climatelaws.org, all the laws and policies and litigation around the world. Type anything, type displacement, and you get everything that has to do with that. Tap Sudan, and you get the policies in Sudan. So everything is there, open access, and the pinkish thing is the report that we published last year. So thank you so much. We might have questions. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So thank you. I see there are already many hands rising, and we have a, yeah.
You know, this thing is pretty scary. We have to throw and we have to catch. I can't do that, so I'll bring it to you. I find it a bit terrifying to throw this at people. But you can throw to the next. You speak here.
Yeah. Thank you. That was very inspiring in both presentations. For Joana in particular, I wanted to ask about, I know you said you wanted to keep it hopeful, but I was wondering if you could comment briefly on the Energy Charter Treaty and just the role of investor-state dispute mechanisms in general, because these are, coercive forms of litigation that I think are very problematic when it comes to meeting net zero goals. But I'm wondering if there are ways of sort of strategically undermining them that you find promising, or if you've heard of anything.
Are we doing rounds, or should I already? Yeah? There's one just behind, maybe.
Let's collect 3 questions and then you're.
Yeah, cool.
You need to talk in the black.
Okay, is this good? Okay, thanks. Yeah, I wanted to ask also on the litigation question. I wanted to ask about the relationship of litigation to larger strategies of mobilization and organizing. I know in the law and society literature, especially drawing on the US case, there's a lot of discussion about how litigation can actually be demobilizing in addition to being mobilizing. And I think, the takeaway is that, my takeaway is that it can go either way, and that it needs to be thought about, that a movement can become too focused on litigation. And then also mobilizing is actually sometimes a different thing than the type of organizing that the mole is doing. And so when you're thinking in terms of organizing instead of mobilizing, it seems that the litigation needs to be part of a broader strategy. So maybe the mole has an underground room of lawyers, but also underground rooms doing other things too. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that fits together in the overall strategy. Thanks.
There's one here.
Thanks.
There it is. Yeah, it's really fascinating about law. Of course, climate change causes harm. Law speaks to harm. But judicial activism is a, you know where this question's going, right? Especially the weakening of the EPA this week. I mean, to me, I still think it's going to be broad-based change in how people see these issues. I think that's going to win the battle. And I just wanted a little bit of thought on you know, are we in 20 years from now, we're like, oh no, climate litigation went the other way, right? So, thank you.
Yeah, maybe you can answer and then we collect another round. Yeah.
Thank you. Excellent. Really, really, really good questions. So I'll start with the ISDS question, which is something I've been also very interested and looking more. And I'll give you an example to show how disturbing this is. So, you know, I told you about the amazing Urgenda case. So they won, they got the Dutch government to do more. The Dutch government phases out coal. I said that's a case of success. I didn't tell you what happened next. You know what happened? RWE, the same that is being sued by Saul Luciano Liuya. RWE files an arbitration case against the Dutch government. So Urgenda got, I said, a few millions of state money invested in the transition. Guess how many millions RWE is asking the same Dutch government to pay RWE because they're phasing out coal sooner than they had agreed in their contract. So you see how litigation, and this goes to, you know, the other questions, how it is very, very double-edged sword. And even I wouldn't like to be the Dutch government. They already seem pretty good trying to do, you know, it's a very civilized country. I come from Brazil, so I can say that. So they seem already, to me, very good. So they are sued by NGOs that are unhappy with the rhythm of things. They try to do the right thing, phase out coal, and then they're sued by the massive corporation, again, with the very expensive, bright lawyers, asking for millions on arbitration, which is a very obscure process, which sometimes we don't even know what they are about. We don't have access to documents. That all happens in secrecy. So that's very important. And then specifically with the Energy Charter, it is one that has channeled all of this to be as it is. So the Energy Charter is now being rediscussed, modernized, as they say. And there's been, last week, there was the first litigation. It's a very crazy case filed against a bunch of, so before the European Court, basically against the Energy Charter, and a lot of movement asking countries to sign out. So it is something that we have to be careful and look and write and study and talk about, because otherwise these companies will be suing in investment trade. Second, they come together, the questions. So the demobilization through litigation. Yeah, you gave the answer. Litigation is part of a broader strategy, and this is something I think that the movement understands. What I think the movement still needs to understand is that, you know, when you get a bunch of young people to file a case, you can't just use their youth. You know also why you bring these youth cases, because in law, it's very hard to prove standing for something that doesn't affect you. So, you know, I'm quite old. I can't bring a case saying that the decision of the government in 250 is concerning, because I'm not going to be around. A young person can. So this is what the Neubauer case says. That, look, in 2050, I'm screwed and you're not around. Therefore, I have standing. So, you know, that's great in terms of proving standing and telling the narrative. However, you know, say they lost, or say that they win, but still this youth is not getting the answer that they want. Or the local communities in Vanuatu Islanders who still won't get, you know, so is it going to be disempowering? Are the lawyers using the names of these youth and communities to bring exciting cases and make the headlines? You know, so I think these are really important questions, and it's, I would go back to the literature on other movements on racial segregation and human rights that have looked into that. And then finally, it brings together the issue on judicial activism, which kind of comes both ways. And it's a very short anecdote. There's a very important case in Pakistan where the judge, it was a successful case, and the judge was accused of being an activist judge. because he basically told the government that the government had to do more, etc. So once I was talking to this judge, and he said, I'm not an activist judge, I'm a judge. I'm deciding according to the law and according to the science. However, litigation comes the other way around, and just last week we had this horrible precedent coming from the US Supreme Court on West Virginia versus EPA, which shows that now maybe something that had been achieved or that could have been achieved, we went backwards, and now we'll be stuck in a decision like that for many years. So yeah, it's not a perfect magic solution.
Thank you. So the second and last round of questions. Here's the first one.
Thanks for both of your presentations. So I'll try to ask a question that works across both the papers and follows from this comment earlier about the moles underground and needing the room of lawyers, but also maybe other rooms of other people. And so the question is about the role of science in both of your cases. And so there's been a lot of work in the scientific community amongst authors connected to the IPCC and others around attribution studies, so in the litigation cases particularly. And so I'm just curious, I hear a lot of this and I read these studies, and the reports have been coming out since 2016, maybe these after-event studies that kind of assign the percentage of damages or intensity for a particular event that was produced by the fact that we're charting a new path in our climate trajectory. And so are those starting to have some kind of impact in the climate litigation cases, and is there a counter movement against that kind of scientific activism? And I guess in the petrochemical side, it still feels to me from the outside that the petrochemical industry just escapes a lot of scrutiny compared to just the pure fossil fuel companies. As a consumer of feedstock from the fossil fuel sector, as deeply linked with the fossil fuel sector. And so I'm just kind of curious what kind of visibility, how science is maybe helping make that sector emerge more through communication, but through studies that kind of help separate them further from other industry groups. And then on the flip side, the deep vulnerabilities that we're all going to face as these huge petrochemical plants are being impacted by climate impacts. And so Houston was a great example with Hurricane Harvey, where you have all of these standing pools of feedstock chemicals that are just a huge sitting liability or a huge public threat. And so I'm curious to hear in your work, Ma, how you're thinking about some of those issues. So.
Thank you. So we would have room for 1, 2 other questions. Is there anyone? Yes.
Hi, thanks so much for your presentations. I have a question for both of you, one question each for both of you. I'm wondering, Joana, in terms of litigation, especially against governments, how you think about this national level sort of limitation, because ultimately with the Dutch cases, it's the case that the duty of care law that allowed these cases to go forward, I think was the government has a duty of care for its citizens. And climate change is a global issue, and taking positive action on climate helps us all, but it's possible that the Dutch government would stop, the impacts of climate change are unequal across the world, so it may stop when Dutch citizens are protected, right? So are there ways to think about this on the international level at international courts? And then my question to Alice is about the subterranean work that you think might transcend boundaries or the borders in this way. I'm wondering whether you think there's scope to support a movement that might, on a more international level, with or without litigation through these subterranean modes.
So, last chance. No, then one question for me to Alice. I would be interested, could you, let's say, conceptualize or locate litigation within the other tools of political activism? So we talked mainly about litigation, but you talked about activism, and litigation is obviously only one tool. So how to think about this tool compared to other tools? Thank you. The floor is yours.
I don't know if I can muster all. I'll try. Thank you for your questions. So on the role of science, and I think one thing that's really important to recognize about the petrochemical industry in relation to climate change is that they position themselves as part of the solution. They provide, the green technologies, the circular economy solutions, the green hydrogen. They're in the wind turbines and so on. So they monopolize a lot of the science, and so I think. A lot of the citizen science that's focused on criticizing the petrochemical industry has focused primarily on toxic exposures. But why I think it's quite exciting to start linking it to climate and plastics is to start to bring these into greater conversation. So, for example, on a lot of the litigation and the risk assessment around if a company is not performing their climate duty, there's also a move to consider toxic liability. So I think that there's a lot of work still to be done, and the problem is that the levels of expertise and technocratic control of the infrastructures and systems make it very difficult to penetrate on an activist level. Subterranean work that transcends boundaries. I mean, I think that is really, really difficult. I mean, I think a lot of there's this idea of around the degrowth movement or around alternative cosmologies among indigenous peoples, thinking about islands outside of outside of capitalism that are constructing different worlds and thinking differently, and whether that might permeate into dominant cultures. But yeah, I don't have a very good answer to that. I mean, I think, as you might have seen from the presentation, I felt like, okay, I have to speak about what's really positive and good about activism. And if you look at a systemic, enduring, toxic colonialism, racism, capitalism context, then there are small wins, but there are also a lot of challenges. And so it's just really difficult to see where, apart from a few little moments, that might happen. And I think, yeah, a lot of imagination work also needs to be done. So that's probably a bad answer, and yeah, conceptualizing litigation. I mean, litigation is used a lot in among activists. I mean, in the case of the Bayou Bridge, they did make a case, the activists, and they lost it. And it was that classic kind of power imbalance. So it is used differently in China because they don't use case law. They use, like it's more about interpretation of the law. But yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thank you for the questions.
And I'll give a 1-minute answer to something that could take days, but I'm aware of time. So attribution science is critical in litigation, especially in compensation damages cases. So the best case that is now out there testing that is exactly, again, the São Lucílio Nuliuia case, because the only way that they can prove that Saul and Huaraz deserve to be compensated is through attribution science. That science that shows that, yes, you've emitted, but this is how much more harmful it is, and therefore you have to pay for that. I would refer you to an excellent paper by Rupert Stewart Smith and Fred Iotto and colleagues, especially in regards to litigation. So they work on attribution science, but they did this analysis looking at how the existing cases are not using state-of-the-art climate attribution science. And that perhaps if they were, they would have even a better chance of winning, but it means that maybe the next cases will use more of this really exciting new area of science that can help so much, especially in the compensation cases. And then finally, with the second question, I will answer giving the Urgenda example. So when Urgenda filed the case, they were seeking protection to so the duty of care recognition to protect Dutch citizens and citizens around the world. And this was one of the things that the court said, we can't do that. You know, we can protect Dutch citizens. And we stopped there. Of course, we know that with climate change, ultimately, you know, whatever you do here, it reverberates everywhere. But in law, that's very hard to get courts protecting something that goes beyond their jurisdiction. So it is it's an issue that we call extraterritoriality of, and there's a lot being written and studied about that.
Yeah, thank you all for this great.